Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gil Holmes, Executive Director of the ACLU of Indiana, and I'd like to really welcome you all here today for what we hope will be a stimulating discussion. Before I turn the podium over to our distinguished panelists as well as our moderator, I'd like to just have a couple of comments. We're going to keep this 50 minutes, which means basically it's going to move relatively quickly. I wanted to thank our sponsors before we begin. I'd like to thank WFYI for making this facility possible for us and hosting this event, and also for advertising the event, which they've done a great job of, and we appreciate that very much. I'd like to also thank the Center for Free, CCFI, the Center for Free, yes, Inquiry. Center for Inquiry for their help, because they're providing the person who will do the taping of our show, which will later be available on our website for those who'd like to hear it, see it live or in recorded. I'd like to also thank Nouveau Magazine, who does a great job of advertising our events as well. And finally, Pam Frazier from Frazier Productions, who does a great job of doing our graphics for this show, and all of the volunteers, because we couldn't exist without the volunteers who contribute so much to the ACLU of Indiana and to civil liberties. And so I'll have a few remarks to make at the end of the program, but I'd like to, at this point, introduce Amos Brown, who is a distinguished journalist, well regarded in our state and nationally for his journalism, and he will serve as moderator and introduce our panel.
Thank you, Gil. I'm so happy that at least one of the panelists is laid back and casual, so I don't feel so bad. And since I'm so used to always doing discussions with attorneys, I must remind everybody that they cannot speak on any case that is currently active or any case that is on appeal. So we have to phrase everything in hypotheticals, because I don't want Randall Shepard to come after me and treat me like Casey Anthony. Anyway, police, use of force, crossing the threshold. So we have this distinguished panel, John Kotzman from Ruckelshaus, Kotzman, Blackwell, Burness, Hasbrook, and others. He has great clients, including the men and women of the Fraternal Order of Police, the men and women of law enforcement in our community. Terry Curry, you know, the Marion County prosecutor, who my audience is going to love him today because they've been wanting to crack down on parents that don't send their kids to school forever. So Terry now has just many more votes because of that. Bill Marsh, federal public defender, and the one and only Larry Landis, executive director of the Indiana Public Defenders Council. Let me give a hypothetical from Law and Order, basic version. So they were chasing after an alleged cop killer. And the African-American, this was the last part of Law and Order, where you had the rotund African-American and the real intense white guy as the two detectives. So they find out where the suspect was from his mother. Tell the mother, say, you better tell us or we're going to bust in there. Mother gives him the key. The entire SWAT of NYPD goes into the house. The brother catches the brother on the ground. He's wounded, gun next to him. He grabs him, and as he's trying to cuff him, he says to his partner, call the paramedics, call the paramedics. And the other officer is like this, like, you know, I really want to shoot this so-and-so because he killed 4 police officers. In the context of an officer emotional, doing his job but caught up in emotions, it has been my experience over the years at the time that police officers get the most emotional in a case is when one of their own has lost their lives. In that context, in the question use of force crossing the threshold, when an officer is in a situation where their emotions are high, the humanness of them may get the better of them. How then do you train or keep that officer from not crossing that threshold? And let me start with Brother Kotzman.
Well, I'm no expert on police training. I mean, I think the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department does an outstanding job with their training academy. I think a similarly outstanding job is done with police across the state. at least from my perspective and my view in interacting with those individuals. So I think it starts with good, sound training programs that are administered both at the ILEA and the INPD Academy. It would be foolish for any training program not to acknowledge the human element that is going to come into a situation like that. And I understand that they do a pretty good job of getting officers to try to experience those feelings, understand what it's going to be like, recreate those situations, and they use those shoot and don't shoot technology simulator situations to kind of put them as close as they can to a real life situation so that they have some sense of what it's going to be like when the adrenaline is flowing and the need to control their emotions and their nerves. Now, my experience is most officers will acknowledge that their nerves and emotions probably are racing out of control, but their experience and their training has them instinctively know that they need to remain controlled and professional, and they kind of almost jump into autopilot. They know what they need to do based on their training and experience. If a threat exists, they're going to respond appropriately to the threat, but if a threat doesn't exist, they know how to stand down and dial it back down. And so from my experience, I don't think we should try to get them to be robots or be non-emotional human beings. I think we should acknowledge that and then have them continue to work on being able to control their actions.
Prosecutor, your thoughts on this scenario when the emotions gets the better of that professional and they do something they had no business?
Sure. First of all, I would note that I absolutely refuse to ever watch any TV lawyer shows or lawyer movies. So I'm not sure I follow your hypothetical. But no, first of all, I think John alluded to this, and that is, from our perspective as a partner of law enforcement, we would expect law enforcement officers to exercise the same professionalism, whether they're chasing a shoplift suspect or chasing someone who has killed any person, whether it's a police officer or whatever. We don't participate, obviously, directly in training of police officers, although we kind of do on a haphazard basis. But more importantly, one thing we're trying to do since taking office is as part of our screening process, which is where police officers bring their cases to our office for screening and review to determine whether charges are appropriate. As we review those cases, we're making it more of a focus to make sure that we provide feedback to the police officers if they have done something inappropriately, to make sure that it not be done going forward. Obviously, it's not going to prevent what has occurred, but we really feel it's important to provide that input, that feedback, so that we're not losing cases because of something that the police have done inappropriately. As it relates to crossing the line, we obviously never ever want that to happen, but if it does, there's clearly a point at which force becomes unreasonable, and if that occurs, then we would consider further investigation of that as a criminal matter.
Bill Marsh, weigh in on this with your wisdom, and kind of move the microphone up so everybody can hear you.
Be pretty short if it's limited to my wisdom. But Amos, I think you focused on the right point when you asked about training and supervision, discipline in the first instance, because here's how I think of these cases. Everybody agrees that in some I think everybody agrees that in some circumstances it's necessary and legal for law enforcement people to use force in executing their duties. I think everybody agrees that use of excessive force is not necessary and is not legal. Now, drawing the line between those two is, of course, a difficult question. So then, to me, it becomes a question of who's going to decide where that line comes in an individual case, whether it be your hypothetical or some other case. In the first instance, the law enforcement officer on the scene is going to be making a judgment. That presumably is going to be reviewed by his superiors in some context. The prosecutor in an egregious, terribly egregious case may make that decision, either the state prosecutor or federal prosecutor, because use of excessive force can be a state crime, can also be a federal crime. And then lawyers who bring civil cases can review the case, and ultimately it could be up to a jury to decide. So where in the process does the decision get made? Wherever it gets made, a degree of deference is going to be given to the judgment made by the police officer. Everybody recognizes that officers need to make tough calls and make tough decisions. and so a degree of deference is given. It's also the case that if excessive force is used, there is no remedy which is going to undo the harm that's caused. If the prosecutor prosecutes somebody, if a lawyer sues somebody, that's not going to undo the harm that's caused. So the focus needs to be on the discipline, the training, the supervision, and the culture of the police organization to have people in the right frame of mind, as John said they hopefully are. In terms of how much deference is going to be given to the conduct of the police officer, I think the fact that a law enforcement officer has been killed is a factor that's going to be taken into account. Whether, obviously, if it's the superior, the prosecutor, in my judgment, is not a very good person to be reviewing and trying to control the actions of law enforcement officers, because they are, as Terry just said, partners in fighting crime, and it's difficult to be on the side of the law enforcement officer one day and then prosecute one of the brethren the next. So the key really is to prevent it from happening before it happens, because quite candidly, without going on any longer, the legal remedies, whether they be civil or criminal, just are not adequate to solve the problem.
Larry Landis.
Well, first of all, police officers are human beings, and no amount of training or education is going to make them immune from fear, anger, panic, all of the emotions. So those are just human elements that we have to appreciate and understand. That when you're in a combat situation, which many police officers are on the street, they're going to react like human beings react. And whether it's an individual citizen that is involved and engaged in a situation where they are panicking or fearful, you often hear of situations where a person with a handgun can fire 6 shots and they think they fired 1. That happens with police officers too, which shows they are just as human as anybody else. They can empty a gun and think that they pulled it once, but in fact their brain is panic mode, and it's a survival instinct. And so what it shows is the importance of having checks and balances and oversight. And you have to have civilian oversight, you have to have police oversight, so that the community understands there's going to be excesses when you have put police in a situation where their life is in danger, or they're trying to protect their fellow police officers. So when it happens, it ought not be a shock that human beings will have human fear, and sometimes the police reaction is not excessive force, but it's actually the failure to engage. It is the failure to actually do what should be done in apprehending a citizen. And so there's errors on both sides, because police officers are human beings, and it should be understood that.
Is it fair, since there's a lot of us on this panel, except for Mr. Crossman, that has lots of gray hair?
I'm getting there.
You get it? I can remember when I moved here in 75, 76, 77, 78, that there was, again, coming from Chicago, a rash of police action shootings that resulted using the use of deadly force. And I know TLC, Gene Slaymaker, editorialized vociferously on that practice. It seems today that the time an officer has to pull their weapon, use the weapon, and results in deadly force is now extremely rare in this city. That there is a police action fatality, it is rare. And that even a police action shooting is rare. The fact that those most serious use of force are so rare, does that magnify each occurrence? And if I'm incorrect in my perception, please correct me.
No, I think you're right. I think, first of all, the fact that it is extremely rare is a testament to the degree of training these officers receive, especially in those simulated situations where they are really put through the paces on being able to exercise appropriate restraint and not fire their weapon unless they truly are in a life and death threatening scenario. So I think that is a testament to them. I think it's also a testament to some advances in technology. There are more and more officers being armed with the use of less lethal weapons like tasers, situations that can assist them in the force continuum on not having to go up to deadly force and still be able to control a situation. So I do think it's rare, but I think that's a testament to a lot of different factors that are positive factors as well. Now, I will weigh in on a couple things that my colleagues said.